Hello, and welcome to this bonus segment of building a CMDB integration. My name is Nick Ryan, and in this video, we are going to cover some steps that we didn't see when building out the full CMDB integration for Kong gateways, but are very important to understand and may come in handy in your own integrations. So let's take a look at some of what we're going to dive into. The first thing is not so much anything that you would need to do to enable this, but it's good to be aware that the integration dashboard will actually reflect data about your integration that you build without you having to do anything. So we'll take a quick look at the dashboard. The Kong Services ETL definition that we created had a number of things that are important to understand should you run into the situation where you want to use the same data source to populate multiple CI classes. And we'll start to take a look at some of the scripting options available in there as well. Similarly, with the Kong Routes ETL, we'll see when it might be useful to do CI lookups and to use that transform option. There's a multi-input script option as well. And there's some things that are a little bit interesting about the relationships that we built in that ETL that I'll point out. And then finally, we'll look at how to use the CI lookup to populate some reference fields as part of the ETL process. So let's jump in. So to start, here is the integration dashboard. So if you're looking for it, it should be under the service graph connectors menu, and then there's an integration dashboard there. And so what this actually will show us over here on the right-hand side is all the applications. So if you have service graph connectors installed, they would show up in this list as well. But the CMDB application that we just created, the now Kong GW application, shows here as well. So you can filter by that. And it'll show us a number of things about how many imports have run over a certain time period and some useful information about which CI classes are actually getting populated during this time frame. And so even though we've only got one Kong gateway, we've run that import a number of times. And so it's actually not just what's been added, but what also has potentially been updated. So you see it's been unchanged 64 times. And so that would be expected in this case. So going beyond that, let's jump into the next area that's interesting in terms of looking at our Kong Services ETL and going into some of the more nuances around this. So the first thing that I'll show you is that in the case of this mapping, I actually wanted to use this same data set to populate the managed API class and the API backend. And that's because Kong is a little bit nuanced in that they don't have the concept of a higher level API object that many other gateways have. So we're going to reuse the backend, or what they would call the services in Kong, to represent both the backend and the actual API in this case. But let's go back and actually look at some of the data that we needed to create in this. So when we're looking at the transform section of this, you'll see these columns in gray, and all the gray columns are things that we created as part of this. The columns in white that are not shaded are the native columns that came from the import. And so that's what we have to work with. And so we want to do some transformations, like one that there's a convert to numeric one, because everything comes in as a string unless you specify otherwise in the data source somewhere. So we're going to lop that .0 off of that. And you'll see here it is in this part here. But let's start out with the fact that because I'm mapping to two different classes, remember the managed API and the API backend, I need to have two different source native keys for that. And so it's not terribly difficult. The source native key for the API is the actual service ID itself. So we brought in the ID that's unique in the Kong gateway. And so that's pretty easy. We use that for mapping the managed API. But for the API backend, we need to create a different one. So we actually use that same ID and we just concatenated back to it. And so if we look at the concatenation feature though, what you see is that you have to put in two actual column names. And so you can put in more by clicking the plus button, but you have to put in at least two. So I want the ID, and then I had to create a column just with the value of back. It's just a static value. So you'll see in the transforms, set a fixed value column. So that's going to be used a lot throughout these transformations where we have to do things like concatenating a fixed value to that. So that's important for making sure you're forming your source native keys to be truly unique in this case. And so let's look at actually a scripting option here. So there's different types of APIs. We've got REST APIs, which are the most popular, but there's SOAP, there's WebSocket, there's gRPC, and so on. And so Kong actually will tell us in the protocol value, if I go all the way over to the data that came in, there's a protocol. And so you'll see there's these different values in this case, but it also could be WS, WSS, gRPC, sgRPC. There's different values that can come across, and they represent and can tell us that these are different types of APIs. And so I want to populate, because it's actually a choice list on our table, on the managed API table. It's a choice list for the type. And so I need to match those up so that it populates correctly. So here I chose the script operation to do this. I said, this is the output column. So you see the API type is our output column. And then the input is that protocol field that comes from Kong. So that input actually comes in the form of an array. And so that's why the scaffolding for this, if you open it up by default, it will have this for loop and this input value here for you. And then you fill out the rest of the code, and then this output field needs to be set. But in this case, I'm just saying, all right, my default is going to be REST. And then I'm going to look and see if the protocol includes WS, which would indicate that it's a WebSocket, or if it contains gRPC, then it's a gRPC type of API. And so that's just one example of how to use a script. We'll see a couple others and go along here. And then I'm just going to set that type value in the output. So very handy if you have some advanced logic that you need to implement in some of these transforms. And so one other one, as we look at this, is the Kong load balancer source native key. So let's take a look at this transform. And this is also a script operation, same type of concept. I'm going to use the host as the input here. And what we're actually going to do is actually query the system. Now, this is something to not get carried away with, because you can create some queries that will have an impact on your processing speed. So I would say to use queries in these scripts very sparingly, and certainly make sure they are as efficient as possible using indexes and so on. But in this case, I want to find the ID value of the load balancer, because I want to actually make a relationship to a Kong load balancer. So I need to get the source native key for the load balancer in this case. And so this script is just going to go query it based on the host value and get us what we need. So let's take a quick look now at some of the mappings. I'm not going to go too much into them. Again, we just set the source native key on the gateway, and similarly on the load balancer, that source native key that we just looked up in the script, all I'm doing is setting that so that I can find the appropriate one when I get to building relationships. And then in these mappings, again, we have the source native key was the ID, which is important to understand being different from the back end. So we're using ID there and then populating the fields as we need for this. On the back end, here we're using a different source native key because if I were to use the same one as the managed API, then those two would actually be in conflict. They would be overwriting each other, which is not good at all. And there's a few more things that we're filling out with the back end, but that's pretty much it. And then the last thing on this ETL that we'll take a look at is the relationships. So this is where we're building out. And again, not all of these are dependent. But this first one is, you can see it actually says dependent relationship here from the gateway to the managed API. And then our managed API to the back end is a suggested relationship. And so it automatically populates this uses and used by relationship. And similarly, where it is applicable, where we're actually, the back end is pointing to a load balancer or what's called an upstream in Kong, we're making that relationship as well. So that's it on the services one. Let's take a look at some of the things that we did in the routes ETL that are a little bit unique compared to what we've done so far. You can go into this transform section here in step number 2. I'm going to go ahead and jump right into where we're going to do the mappings here. On all of these, also, we're just setting the source native key for the gateway. Similarly with the managed API, all we're doing here is setting this source native key. We're not actually doing any updates to it. And similarly with the backend. So in the services ETL, we populated managed API and backend, but now in this routes one, we're actually just wanting to populate front end, but we need to make relationships to these other ones. So that's why they're here as well. And all we do is populate the source native key so we can make sure we find those appropriately for relationship purposes. But we'll come back to this, but we can always get to that transforming the data in the same spot as the mapping. So if you need to add some more, you don't have to toggle back and forth. But we'll see here that we actually have a number of fields that we've also created. So the first one, this API base URL. So in Kong, the routes don't actually come with the full base URL. They have a lot of paths in front of them and other data points, but we want to get the base URL from the API record. And so what we're doing here is actually a CI lookup on this. And there's some important things to understand about doing this lookup because it's actually going against, not directly to the CMDB tables, it's actually looking at the sys object source record and finding the data from that, which is why the inputs for it are the discovery source, the source native key, and the field that you want. If we jump over here real quick and we look at sys object source, and we'll see a number of these, what you see is that there's this source value, right? And the feed is actually where it's coming from, like our data source in this case. And then this ID is our source native key. And then you see it's going to point to the actual CI record. And so what this function is really doing is looking at that sys object source table. We have to give it that Kong gateway source. So I actually set a static value here for now-Kong GW because that's our source, as you see here in this this field over here. And then the source native key, depending on what it is, like in this case, we want to look up the service that this route is associated with, because that's going to give us the managed API source native key, which actually it's what the field is that we want to get from the managed API is the base URL. So I actually had to set that value as well, because this, as you see here, there's this column that I made that's just, again, one of these set fixed value columns. But the input here is not like a free form field. It's actually, you have to pick one of the columns that's in this data set. So that's why I created a column called base URL and just gave it a value of base URL there, so that I could use it in this lookup. And we're going to use this CI lookup in some other places as well. But the result of it is that it went and found the managed API value and gave me the base URL attribute from that CI. So that's what I have here and what I can use for that. Actually, what I'm going to use with that is to create the full URL. And so this is a little bit different in that now we looked at the script operation before, but there's actually a multi-input script option as well. So if you need more than just the one field or column to work with, then you can have multiple here. So in this case, I'm using that base URL that I went and got, as well as the paths for this route. And then you could add more inputs if you want to, but those are the two that I need for this, for creating this full URL. And really all that I'm doing is, again, it's very similar. They come into this as kind of a batch option, and you see that you can actually reference by the column name that you're using there, and that's how you get to each specific input from that standpoint. And so I'm doing some stuff about stripping off any trailing slashes if it happens to have one, because the path value actually comes with a slash at the beginning. So that's what's happening there, and stripping that off of the base. And then I'm just adding the base and the path value here and giving it that to the output. So that's how you can use multi-input scripts. They're useful as well. And the last thing to really see about this ETL function is, again, on the relationships and building those out. And so we set the source native key, I'll go back in here, we set source native key on gateway, managed API, and this backend. And really we just populated front end. So we have all the things set that we need to in this mapping step in terms of finding the right CIs. And then in the relationship step, again, it's pretty easy, just add relationship, choose your parent, choose the child. And if it's dependent, like this one is, it will pull in the dependent relationship automatically. If it's suggested, it actually will also pull in the suggested relationship type, but you can see here, you can actually change that. So in this case, the managed API uses the front end. And in the case of making the connection between the front end and the back end, because I want to know that, hey, this front end is also communicating with this back end, there is a suggested relationship between those two classes as well. And so it automatically populated that when we pulled that in. So that is it on the routes ETL in terms of things I wanted to cover. And last but not least is on the plugins ETL, which the plugins is actually going to a related table. And so if we look at our mapping, you see there's the gateway, but the gateway has a bunch of plugins. And so it's actually it's not a CMDB table, but in this class manager, it is a related item. when you're setting up the identification rules, and you can set up related entries. These plugins are actually related entries for this specific gateway. And so here on the gateway, again, we're just setting the source native key. But if we look at the mappings for the plugins, we go to transforms. This is, again, some things that are very useful to understand. So again, I had to set certain static values here. As you see, this is just setting this static value of back, because we're going to use it as the suffix for our backend source native key. So if you recall, we did this similarly when we were setting up in the Services ETL, and we had to set two different source native keys. We appended the back word to that. So we're looking for that. And then from that, actually, we're doing our CI lookup again, similar to what we did before. I set the data source. So here's our data source value that I had set. I want to use this backend source native key, and I want to get the sysid field. So again, I set a column that says sysid because that's the attribute that I want returned. And so what we're going to do with this is actually create references as we map our data in. And so we did that. The consumer also, we did the same thing here, did a lookup on this. So the raw data actually comes back and tells us, all right, there's an ID of the plugin. If it's associated with the route, it gives us that ID. If it's associated with the service, it gives us that ID. And if it's associated with a consumer, it gives us that ID. So the raw data is what we're using as the source native keys. And so we specify that and say, give me the sysid. So again, if it were populated, then it returns our sysid. And then we do the same for the front end as well. If we look back at our mapping, how that plays out is that we then will say these references to CI classes, go ahead and populate with this transform column and pass in the sysid for the front end, because it's a reference field. Same with back end. And in the consumer column, even though it is a reference as well, it's not a CMDB class. And so we're going to pass in the sysid of that as well. And so with that, we've seen a fair number of ways to use the different transforms available, some script options, and what those can do for us. Excuse me. And hopefully that helps in some places where you need to do something that's not very straightforward in terms of massaging the data and mapping in references and relationships. So good luck in building your CMDB integration, and hope these videos have helped.